On the Ferryman. I will stay by this river, SIDDHARTHA thought. It is the same one I crossed long ago on the way to the child people. A kindly ferryman took me across, and I will go to him. My way to a new life once started at this hut. That life is now old and dead. May my new life, have its starting point here. Tenderly he gazed into the translucent greenness of the flowing water, at the crystalline lines of the mysterious designs it made. He saw pale pearls rising out of the depths and still bubbles floating on the surface with the image of the blue sky in them. The river looked at him with 1,000 eyes, green ones, white ones, crystal ones, sky blue ones. How he loved this river, how it charmed him, how grateful he was to it. In his heart he heard the voice speaking, the newly awakened voice, and it said to him, "Love this river, stay by it, learn from it." Oh yes, he wanted to learn from it, to listen to it. Whoever could understand this river and its mysteries, it seemed to him, would also understand many other things, many mysteries, all mysteries. Among the mysteries of the river today, however, he saw only one that gripped his soul. He saw that the river flowed and flowed and flowed ever onward, and yet was always there, was always the same, yet every moment new. Oh, if one could grasp that, understand that he did not understand or grasp it, felt only an inkling stir, a distant memory, divine voices. SIDDHARTHA got up. The stabs of hunger in his body had become unbearable. Driven by pain, or driven by them, he wandered up the path on the riverbank, upriver. He listened to the current, listening to the snarling of hunger in his gut. When he reached the place where the ferry crossed, the boat lay at the ready. And the same ferryman who had once taken the young Shramana across the river stood in the boat. SIDDHARTHA recognized him. He too had greatly aged. "Will you take me across?" he asked. The ferryman, astonished to see such an eminent person wandering alone and on foot, took him into the boat and pushed off. "You have chosen a wonderful life," said the guest. "It must be wonderful to live every day on this river and ply its waters." Smiling, the oarsman swayed back and forth. "It is wonderful, Lord, as you say, but is not every life, every task wonderful? That may be, however, I envy you yours. Ach, you might soon get tired of it. It is not something for people in fine clothes." SIDDHARTHA laughed. "Already once today I have been judged by my clothes suspiciously. Will you not, Ferryman, accept from me these clothes, which have become a burden to me, for you should know that I have no money to pay the price of the crossing." "The Lord is joking," laughed the Ferryman. "I'm not joking, my friend. Listen. Once before you took me across this river in your boat for nothing more than the gratitude of the gods. Do that again today and accept my clothing for it as well." "And does the Lord intend to continue his travels without any clothes?" "Actually, I would prefer not to continue my travels at all. What I would most like, Ferryman, is if you would give me an old tunic and keep me with you as your helper, or rather as your apprentice. For to begin with, I will have to learn how to work with the boat." The ferryman gave the stranger a long and searching look. "Now I recognize you," he said at last. "Once you slept in my hut, a long time ago now. Perhaps more than 20 years ago, and I took you across the river, and we parted from each other, good friends. Were you not a Shramana? I cannot any longer recall your name." "My name is SIDDHARTHA, and I was a Shramana when you last saw me." "Then you are welcome, SIDDHARTHA. My name is Vasudeva, Vasudeva, Vasudeva. I hope you will be my guest again today and sleep in my hut and tell me where you come from and why your beautiful clothes are such a burden to you." They had reached the middle of the river, and Vasudeva leaned harder on his oar in order to make headway against the current. He worked calmly with his powerful arms, his eye on the prow of the boat. SIDDHARTHA sat and watched him and recalled how, long ago in the last days of his time as a Shramana, love for this man had arisen in his heart. With gratitude he accepted Vasudeva's invitation, which they came alongside the bank. He helped him tie up the boat at its mooring. Then the ferryman asked him to come into the hut and offered him the bread and water, which SIDDHARTHA ate with pleasure, as well as the mangoes that Vasudeva offered him. Afterward, it was getting on towards sunset. They sat down on a tree trunk on the bank, and SIDDHARTHA told the ferryman about his origins and about his life as he had seen it pass before his eyes that day during his hour of despair. His tale lasted deep into the night. Vasudeva listened with great attention. As he listened, he took everything in: origins and childhood, all the studying, the seeking, all the toys, all the troubles of the ferryman. Of the ferryman's virtues, this was one of his greatest. He knew how to listen as few people do. Though Vasudeva spoke not a word himself, the speaker felt him receiving his words into himself, quietly, openly, unhurriedly, missing nothing, not jumping ahead through impatience, attributing neither praise nor blame, just listening. SIDDHARTHA felt what happiness can come from opening oneself to such a listener, having one's own life, one's seeking, one's suffering enter this other's heart. Toward the end of Siddhartha's story, as he was talking about the tree by the river, of how low he had fallen, of the sacred Om, and what deep love he had felt for the river after his sleep, the ferryman listened with attention redoubled, fully and completely given over, his eyes closed. When Siddhartha had stopped talking, and after the long silence that followed had passed, Vasudeva said, "It is as I thought. The river spoke to you. It is your friend too. It speaks to you too. That is good. That is very good. Stay with me, Siddhartha, my friend. Once I had a wife. Her bed was next to mine, but she died long ago. I have lived by myself for a long time. Live with me now. There is room and food for both of us." "Thank you," said Siddhartha. "Thank you and accept. And I also thank you, Vasudeva, for having listened to me so well. Few people know how to listen, and I never met anyone who knows how as well as you. And this too I will learn from you." "You will learn that," said Vasudeva, "but not from me. The river taught me how to listen. You will learn that from the river too. The river knows everything. Everything can be learned from it. Look, you have already learned from the river that it is good to aim low, to sink, to seek the bottom. The rich and prominent Siddhartha has become an oarsman's helper. This, too, was the advice of the river. You will learn the other thing from it, too." After a long pause, Siddhartha said, "What is the other thing, Vasudeva?" Vasudeva got up. "It is late," he said. "Let us go to sleep. I cannot tell you what the other thing is, my friend. You will learn it. Perhaps you know it already. Look, I am no scholar. I do not know how to talk, and I also do not know how to think. I only know how to listen and how to be respectful. I have not learned anything else. If I could express that and teach it, perhaps I would be a wise man. But as it is, I am only a ferryman, and my task is to take people across this river. I have taken many across thousands, and for all of them, my river has been nothing but an obstacle on their journey. They were traveling for money and business, to weddings, on pilgrimages, and the river was in their way. The ferryman was to take them quickly past the obstacle. For a few among thousands, very few, 4 or 5 of them, the river stopped being an obstacle. They heard its voice and listened to it, and the river became sacred to them as it has to me. Let us now take our rest, Siddhartha." Siddhartha stayed with the ferryman and learned the work of the boat. And when there was nothing to do on the ferry, he worked with Vasudeva in the rice field, gathered wood, picked fruit from the banana tree. He learned how to make an oar, repair the boat, weave baskets, and was glad about everything he learned. And the days and months passed swiftly by. But the river never taught him more than Vasudeva could. He learned from it unceasingly. Above all, he learned from it how to listen with a still heart, with an expectant, open soul, without passion, without desire, without judgment, without opinion. He and Vasudeva lived together in friendship, and from time to time they exchanged words, few words, long pondered. Vasudeva was no friend of words. Siddhartha seldom succeeded in getting him to talk. Once he asked him, "Have you also learned from the river the secret that there is no time?" A bright smile came over Vasudeva's face. "Yes, Siddhartha," he said. "This is probably what you mean, that the river is everywhere at once, at its source, at its mouth, by the waterfall, by the ferry crossing, in the rapids, in the sea, in the mountains, everywhere at the same time. And that for it there is only the present, not the shadow called the future." "That's it," said Siddhartha. "And when I learned that, I looked at my life, and it too was a river. And the boy Siddhartha and the man Siddhartha and the old man Siddhartha were only separated by shadows, not by anything real. Siddhartha's previous births were also not a past, and his death and return to Brahma were not a future. Nothing was, nothing will be. Everything is. Everything has its being and its present." Siddhartha spoke with rapture. This revelation had brought him profound happiness. Was not all suffering time? Was not all self-torment and fearfulness time? Was not all that was heavy and hostile in the world overcome with once one had overcome? Was not all that was heavy and hostile in the world overcome and over with once one had overcome time? Had been able to rid oneself of the notion of time. He had spoken with rapture, but Vasudeva only smiled at him radiantly and nodded confirmation. Silently he nodded, stroked Siddhartha's shoulder with his hand, and returned to his work. And another time in the rainy season, when the river was swollen and rushing headlong, Siddhartha said, "Is it not true, friend, that the river has many voices, very many voices? Does it not have the voice of a king, of a warrior, of a bull, of a night bird, of a woman giving birth, of a man sighing, and 1,000 other voices too?" "That is true," nodded Vasudeva. "All creatures' voices are in its voice. And do you know, Siddhartha continued, what word it speaks when you succeed in hearing all its 10,000 voices at once?" Happiness shone in Vasudeva's face as he laughed. He leaned over to Siddhartha and whispered the sacred Om into his ear, and that is just what Siddhartha had also heard. And from one occasion to the next, his smile came more and more to resemble the ferryman's. It became nearly as radiant, nearly as a glow. with happiness, shown in the same way out of 1,000 little wrinkles, was just as much like a child's and just as much like an old man's. Many travelers, seeing the two ferrymen, took them for brothers. Often the two sat in the evening on the tree trunk on the bank and listened in silence to the river, which for them was not a river, but the voice of life, the voice of what is, eternal becoming. And occasionally it happened that while listening to the river, both men would think of the same thing. A conversation from the day before yesterday, one of their passengers whose face and fortune had caught their interest, of death or their childhood, and then at the same moment, when the river had said something good to them, they would look at each other, both thinking exactly the same thing, both gladdened by the same answer to the same question. Something emanated from the ferry and the two ferrymen that was sensed by many of the travelers. It sometimes happened that a traveler, after looking into the face of one of the ferrymen, began to tell the story of his life, recounted his suffering, confessed evil, and asked for consolation and advice. It happened occasionally that one of the travelers asked permission to stay for an evening and listen to the river. It also came to pass that curiosity seekers came who had been told that two wise men or magicians or saints live at the ferry crossing. The curiosity seekers asked many questions, but they got no answers, and they found neither magicians nor wise men. They found only two old and kindly little men who seemed to be mute and a bit odd and dotty. And the curiosity seekers laughed and had conversations about how foolish and gullible people were to spread such empty rumors. Years went by with nobody counting them. Once monks came wandering who were followers of Gautama the Buddha. They asked to be taken across the river, and from them the ferryman learned that they were going with all speed back to see their great teacher, for the word had spread that the Exalted One was mortally ill and would soon die his last death as a human and enter the state of liberation. Not long after, another large group of monks came, and then another, and then the monks, as well as most of the other travelers and wanderers, spoke of nothing but Gautama and his impending death. As to a crusade or a king's coronation, people streamed from everywhere, from all directions, gathering in swarms like ants and streaming onward as though compelled by magic toward the place where the great Buddha was awaiting death, where that enormity was to occur, where the perfect one of the age was to enter into glory. SIDDHARTHA thought a great deal during this time about the dying sage, the great teacher whose voice had counseled nations and awakened hundreds of thousands of people, whose voice he too had heard once, whose holy countenance he too had looked upon with awe. Warmly he thought of him, saw the teacher's path to perfection before his eyes, and remembered with a smile the words that once as a young man he had addressed to the Exalted One. It seemed to him they had been proud and precocious words, had been proud and precocious words, Precocious, precocious words. Smiling, he recalled them. For a long time he had known himself to be no longer separate from Gautama, whose teaching nevertheless he had been able to accept. No, a true seeker, one who truly wished to find, could not accept any doctrine, but he who had found realization could only look with favor on any teaching, any path, any goal. Nothing any longer separated him from 1,000 others who lived the eternal, who breathed the divine. On one of those days when so many people were making their pilgrimage to the dying Buddha, Kamala, once the most beautiful of courtesans, appeared among them. She had long since withdrawn from her former life, had made a gift of her garden to the monks of Gautama, had taken refuge in the teaching, and was among the friends and benefactors of those traveling to see the Buddha. Along with the boy SIDDHARTHA, her son, she had begun her journey as soon as she had heard of the Buddha's imminent death. On one of those days when so many people were making their pilgrimage to the dying Buddha, Kamala, once the beautiful of courtesans, appeared among them. She had long since withdrawn from her former life, had made a gift of her garden to the monks of Gautama, had taken refuge in the teaching, and was among the friends and benefactors of those traveling to see Buddha. Along with the boy SIDDHARTHA, her son, she had begun her journey as soon as she had heard of the Buddha's imminent death. She wore a simple garment and was traveling on foot. With her little son, she was traveling along the river. But the boy would tire quickly and would want to go back home. He wanted to rest. He wanted to eat. He would become quarrelsome and whiny. Kamala had to make frequent rest stops with him. He was accustomed to imposing his will on hers. She had to feed him, console him, scold him. He did not understand why he had to go with his mother on this toilsome and sad journey to an unknown place to see a man he did not know. A man who was holy and lay dying. Let him die. What did the boy care? Those two travelers were not far from Vasudev's ferry crossing when the little SIDDHARTHA prevailed upon his mother to stop for a rest. Kamala also was tired, and while the child chewed on a banana, she squatted on the ground, closing her eyes a little to rest. But as she suddenly emitted a loud wail, the boy looked at her in terror and saw her face go gray with shock. From beneath Kamala's dress, the small black snake escaped. From beneath Kamala's dress, the small black snake escaped that had bitten her. Now the two ran hurriedly down the path, trying to reach some people. They reached the vicinity of the ferry crossing, and there Kamala collapsed, unable to go further. The boy began screaming pitifully. Between screams, he kissed his mother and threw his arms around her neck. She added her voice to his loud cries for help, and the sounds reached the ears of Vasudeva, who was standing by the ferry. He came quickly, took the woman in his arms, and carried her onto the boat with the boy at his heels. Soon the three arrived at the hut where Siddhartha was at the hearth making a fire. He looked up and saw first the face of the boy, which oddly jolted his memory, reminding him of something forgotten. Then he saw Kamala, who he recognized immediately, although she lay unconscious in the ferryman's arms, and now he knew that it was his own son whose face had so startled his memory, and his heart was moved within him. Kamala's wound was washed, but it was already black, and her body was swollen. A healing drink was given to her, and her consciousness returned. She lay on Siddhartha's bed in the hut. And Siddhartha, who had once loved her so dearly, bent over her. She thought she was dreaming. Smiling, she gazed at her friend's face. Only slowly did she piece the situation together. She remembered the snake bite and cried out anxiously for the boy. "He is near, do not worry," said Siddhartha. Kamala looked into his eyes. She spoke with a heavy tongue, numbed by the poison. "You have grown old, my love," she said. "You have gone gray, but you resemble the young Shramana who once came to me in the garden without clothes and with dusty feet. You resemble him a lot more than you did at the same time you left me at Kamaswami. In your eyes, you resemble him, Siddhartha, or I too have grown old. Old. Do you still know me, Siddhartha?" Siddhartha smiled. "I knew you immediately, Kamala, my love." Kamala pointed to the boy and said, "Did you know him too? He is your son." Her eyes lost focus and fell shut. The boy cried. Siddhartha took him on his knee, let him cry, stroked his hair. The look of his child's face recalled to him a Brahmanic prayer which he had learned long ago when he was a child. He began to chant it in sing-song tones. The words flowed to him out of the past from his childhood. Under the spell of the chant, the boy calmed down, shook with a few more sobs, and fell asleep. Siddhartha laid him on Vasudeva's bed. Vasudeva was standing by the hearth cooking rice. Siddhartha gave him a look, which he returned smiling. "She was going to die," said Siddhartha softly. Vasudeva nodded. The light of the flames in the hearth played over his kindly face. Kamala came to again. Pain distorted her face. Siddhartha's eyes read the suffering in her mouth. In her blanched cheeks, he noted it quietly, attentively, patiently, absorbed in her suffering. Kamala felt this, and her eyes sought his. Gazing at him, she said, "Now I see that your eyes have also changed. They have become quite different. So how can I still recognize you as Siddhartha? You are him and you are not." Siddhartha did not speak. In silence, he gazed into her eyes. "You achieved it," she asked. "You found peace?" She's asking him. "You achieved it?" she asked. "You found peace?" He smiled and laid his hand on hers. "I see it," she said. "I see it. I too will find peace." "Yeah, I found it," whispered Siddhartha. Kamala looked steadily into his eyes. She thought about her intention to go see Gautama. She had wanted to see the face of one who had achieved perfection, to breathe in his peacefulness. She thought that instead of him, she had now found Siddhartha, and that this was good, just as good as if she had seen Gautama. She wanted to say this, but her tongue no longer obeyed her will. In silence, she looked at him, and he saw the life going out of her eyes. The last pain filled her eyes and broke. And as the last shudder ran over her limbs, his fingers closed her eyelids. Long he sat and looked at her dead face. For a long time he looked at her mouth. He looked at her mouth, her old tired mouth with its shrunken lips, and he remembered that once in the springtime of his years he had compared that mouth to a fig freshly broken open. He sat for a long time contemplating the pallid face, the tired wrinkles, filling himself with the sight. He saw his own face reposing that way, just as white, just as lifeless, and at the same time he saw his face and her face when young, with the red lips, the burning eyes, and the feeling of presence and simultaneity, simultaneity, S-I-M-U-L-T-A-N-E-I-T-Y, pervaded him completely, a feeling of eternity. He felt profoundly at the moment, more profoundly than ever, the indestructibility of life, the eternity of every instant, the eternity of every instant. By the time he got up, Vasudeva had prepared him some rice, but Siddhartha did not eat. In the goat stall, the two old men made a bed of straw, and Vasudeva lay down to sleep, but Siddhartha went out and sat in front of the hut through the night, listening to the river, his past washing over him, touched and surrounded by all the periods of his life at the same time. Early in the morning, before the sun became visible, Vasudeva came out of the stall and approached his friend. "You did not sleep," he said. "No, Vasudeva. I sat here and listened to the river. It told me a lot. It filled me deeply with healing thoughts of unity. You experience pain, Siddhartha, but I see that no sadness has entered your heart. No, dear friend, why should I be sad? I, who was once rich and happy, have become still richer and happier, have received the gift of my son. Your son is welcome as far as I am concerned too, but now, Siddhartha, let us get to work. There's plenty to do. Kamala has died in the same bed my wife once died in. We should build Kamala's pyre on the same hill where I once built my wife's pyre. P-Y-R, pyre. P-Y-R-E, pyre. While the boys still slept, they built a funeral pyre. I guess it's maybe a grave. So that was the end of that, man. Damn, she died. Kamala. It's sad. I wonder why she had to get bitten. What was the purpose of her getting bit? Maybe of her sins of her past. I feel like she might have been a prostitute. I could be wrong. Anyway, that was the end of that one.